He was taken into custody earlier this month while shooting a music video in town. The rapper is booked on 4 charges, including being a felon in possession of a firearm and not being the listed owner on a registered firearm.
Baton Rouge rapper Torrance Boosie has been indicted on gun charges for a 2023 arrest in San Diego.
A Louisiana-based rapper appearing in a San Diego courtroom today. The artist, whose real name is Torrance Hatch Jr., was arrested on weapons charges.
Developments in the gun case against a Louisiana-based rapper who was arrested in San Diego last year.
But there's questions about why, if this was a valid charge, should not have been brought initially the first time. And so we'll be raising motions concerning that charge specifically and the government's motivations for bringing the charge so late after Mr. Hatch has exercised his constitutional rights in this case.
Convicted felon and highly controversial rapper Torrance Hatch, aka Boosie, is facing new charges in connection to his arrest in San Diego last year, less than 2 weeks after a federal judge threw out the previous case against him.
Gun case against a Louisiana-based rapper who was arrested in San Diego last year. Today, a San Diego judge threw out the felony firearm possession charge against 41-year-old Torrance Boosie Hatch Jr. Hatch, who's been convicted on drug charges in the past, was arrested in Choias View last May during a traffic stop after authorities say they found 2 loaded handguns in his vehicle. His legal team asked a judge to drop the charges, citing a ruling by a California judge in another case that found stripping a non-violent felon of their right to own a gun was unconstitutional. Ultimately, the judge today agreed and granted Hatch's motion to dismiss.
U.S. Attorney Tyrell McGriff's office filed another indictment against Boosie on Friday for 2 counts of firearm possession, one involving interstate commerce as a convicted felon and one for knowingly possessing a firearm while dealing with abuse of a controlled substance. Boosie was previously charged with possession of a firearm as a felon, but the case was dismissed earlier this month due to a recent federal court proceeding that found the law unconstitutional as it appeals to those convicted of non-violent crimes.
A Louisiana-based rapper appearing in a San Diego courtroom today. The artist, whose real name is Torrance Hatch Jr., was arrested on weapons charges.
He was taken into custody earlier this month while shooting a music video in town. The rapper is booked on 4 charges, including being a felon in possession of a firearm and not being the listed owner on a registered firearm. He plays bond. He is out of jail as of yesterday afternoon.
According to the new indictment, federal prosecutors are reasserting the allegations against Boosie, the center of his previous case, who seek court-mandated forfeiture of all firearms and ammunition involved in commission of the offenses.
Baton Rouge rapper Torrance Boosie Hatch has been indicted on gun charges for a 2023 arrest in San Diego, according to court records. Now, he was arrested back in June 2023 on a felon in possession of a firearm charges when officers first found 2 handguns in his car during a traffic stop. Now, those charges were dropped. A few weeks later, he was charged again with possession of a gun by a convicted felon and drug user for a separate incident. On Wednesday, Hatch posting on X that he felt blindsided by the indictment while on vacation with his family, claiming it was unfair that the indictment, quote, again on the same charge with another added.
Boosie could also face a maximum prison sentence of 10 years if convicted on the second charge of unlawful possession while dealing with substance abuse. Boosie took to Twitter on Wednesday morning to show his disdain for the charges. The post read, and I quote, "I'm on vacation with my family. My lawyer called me and said this federal prosecutor has indicted me again on the same charge. At this point, you're just making this a circus." Local prosecutors first attempted to bring firearm possession charges against Boosie last year. When those were dropped, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms took over the case, rearresting Boosie on June the 14th under a warrant for a similar federal charge. Boosie pleaded not guilty to the federal charge in June and was released on a $100,000 bond shortly after. When that case was dismissed, Boosie posted an Instagram video from the lazy river at San Diego's casino resort celebrating the win. Boosie is expected to be in a San Diego County federal courtroom for another arraignment on August the 2nd. Let me get that monitor.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Oh, yeah. And my PO say the charge is terminated. And I can cut my ankle monitor. Yes,
But there's questions about why, if this was a valid charge, should not have been brought initially the first time. And so we'll be raising motions concerning that charge specifically and the government's motivations for bringing the charge so late after Mr. Hatch has exercised his constitutional rights in this case.
So you said he was turning himself in today in San Diego. Is he going to have to be in custody?
He is not turning himself in today. It's next week. So I think that's where I cut out. The government wanted him to self-surrender today. That makes no sense. He was on bond in his state case. He had no violations. He showed up to court. He showed up to court on time every time. He was on bond in his federal case Hatch won. For over a year, no violations. He showed up to court every single time. There were no issues whatsoever. Issuance of an arrest warrant in those circumstances, something I personally have never seen. As you know, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time before I started doing defense work. That is not something that I had seen as a prosecutor. It's not something I've seen as a defense attorney. Uncalled for in this situation. We moved to recall the arrest warrant. We moved his appearance date, not a self-surrender date. An appearance date next week. So next week, August 2nd, Mr. Hatch will appear in court, not surrendering himself as the prosecution wanted him to do. You know, their request for an arrest warrant in this case, in my opinion, there is no justification for it. He is not in questions. And you have jurisdictions across the country that have ruled that the law as applied to people like Mr. Hatch is unconstitutional. With the backdrop of the Ninth Circuit having already made that specific finding, and you decide to recharge him now, that makes no sense. The statute of limitations in the federal system is 5 years. What that means is the government has 5 years from the time that Mr. Hatch is alleged to have engaged in criminal conduct to file criminal charges against him. Mr. Hatch is arraigned next week.
Yeah. And you said the charges are, it's felon in possession of a firearm. That was the previous charge, or unlawful possession of a firearm. You said there was a second charge in the new case.
There is. So they charged Mr. Hatch with possessing a firearm while being an unlawful user or addict of a controlled substance.
Oh,
I'd like to
charge.
Right. So just as the backdrop on this, we know that Mr. Hatch was under supervision for over a year, federal supervision. One of the conditions of Mr. Hatch's federal supervision is that he was subject to regular drug testing. There have been 0 violations. They know this. They charged an individual who, for the last year following his original arrest in this case, was regularly tested for narcotics by pretrial services, and at no point during any of those tests did Mr. Hatch test dirty. So for you to be charged with this, you've got to be an addict. An addict means someone who, can't control their drug use. You've got to be a user, someone who is actively using while you're possessing the gun. Assuming that charge in itself is even constitutional, and there's significant questions about the constitutionality of that statute anyway. But even if it is constitutional, and even if it is constitutional as applied to Mr. Hatch, look at the facts of the case.
I mean, was there any thought that Duarte would gut that charge? Because we haven't heard that in relation to the Hunter Biden case. And is that the exact charge he was charged with and convicted of in Delaware?
It was. So Hunter Biden was charged with that same charge. It is one that is very infrequently brought. I have been practicing in federal courts for over 20 years. I've had one case prior to this where that count was alleged, and the count ultimately was dismissed. Judge, as his first federal case, it is completely uncalled for. And I reached out to them before I had to move the court to recall that warrant, I reached out to the prosecutors in this case and I asked them to do it on their own, given Mr. Hatch's history, to recall it on their own, because typically in cases like this, when a person is not a flight risk, what happens is the prosecution will just ask counsel, me, to notify their client to come into court on a certain date. They refuse to do that. So even after they sought the arrest warrant, which is something I'd never seen before in a case like this, they then refused to recall it, refused to set it for a hearing. And that is where we are. And that's the atmosphere that Mr. Hatch is defending himself in.
Wow, that's got to be a little concerning and such a letdown from what happened. I mean, it seemed like we had a discussion last week that there was some thought that they weren't going to refile anything until SCOTUS decided Duarte, which could be like 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, this is when the case is over, I'll go more in depth on my personal opinions about the DOJ's move in this case with Mr. Hatch and the prosecutor's specific motivations in this case with Mr. Hatch. But when you have a case like this where there are significant questions about whether Mr. Hatch's conduct as charged is even illegal, significant questions, and you have jurisdictions across the country that have ruled that the law as applied to people like Mr. Hatch is unconstitutional, with the backdrop of the Ninth Circuit having already made that specific finding, and you decide to recharge him now, that makes no sense. And as I mentioned, I think the volume may have cut out. We're filing multiple motions to dismiss. I have additional motions to dismiss based on different issues that we'll raise in the coming weeks. I am extremely optimistic that this is going to be dismissed again. That said, I'm also extremely disappointed in the government's decision to move forward timing-wise now, when all it means is that Mr. Hatch's liberties are going to be curtailed. The government is going to have more control over him when they shouldn't, because they decided to charge the case, to refile charges before the Ninth Circuit has made their en banc ruling in Duarte.